All right. Well, welcome everyone. We want to thank you so much for being here today for another presentation in our All About Alzheimer's monthly and now bi-monthly series, where we hope to bring you useful information that you can take back to your respite and support groups, and or those of you who might be caring for family members or loved ones. This information will be useful for you as well. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. My name is Joan Asseff, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker here in the state of Texas. I have spent most of my career working with older adults in a wide array of settings, including skilled nursing facilities. I was a director of social services in 2 large skilled nursing facilities for about a decade. Also worked in hospice, home health, psychiatric care, and private clinical practice. I now teach social work practice at the Steve Hicks School of Social Work at the University of Texas at Austin, and I really love that role as well. So I have worked extensively with individuals and caregivers going through the extreme challenges of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, and I want to recognize the selfless and painstaking work that caregivers do and those who support caregivers also do as they navigate the challenges that come with supporting those who experience this difficult disease process. We want you to know, of course, that we are recording this session today so that others can benefit from the information in the future. And we invite your participation and questions at the end when we'll have plenty of time for discussion. And I really welcome that discussion and enjoy hearing your thoughts and reflections and experiences. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Just a quick note about Alzheimer's Texas. As many of you may already be aware, Alzheimer's Texas is an independent local nonprofit that used to be known as the Alzheimer's Association Capital of Texas chapter. They have been a privately funded voluntary health organization since 1982, so that's a long time, serving Central Texans with Alzheimer's disease and their caregivers. About 3 or 4 years ago, Alzheimer's Texas broke away to form their own nonprofit and decided to focus 100% of their funds and efforts here in Central Texas. However, Alzheimer's Texas maintains the same level of commitment, providing support, education, and advocacy for those affected by Alzheimer's disease in our community. Currently, Alzheimer's Texas reaches about 12 to 16 counties, though the pandemic has allowed them to reach a broader population in Texas through a virtual platform. So, the virtual world has given us more opportunities to connect with more folks, and that's been great. And Alzheimer's Texas continues to carry out its vital mission to eliminate Alzheimer's disease and related disorders through the advancement of research and to enhance care and support for individuals, their families, and caregivers. And that's part of what we're doing here today. So we're glad you're with us. All right, so I want to introduce some learning objectives for our time together today. We want to define anticipatory grief in terms of the experience of dementia caregivers and their families. I would like to note that research shows that people living with dementia also experience anticipatory grief, but they usually experience it within the earlier stages of the disease process, which I think makes sense if we think about it. For the purposes of this presentation today, we will focus on anticipatory grief impacting dementia caregivers and their families, though I invite questions and reflections on how anticipatory grief can impact those living with dementia as well. We will also understand how anticipatory grief impacts people living with dementia and their caregivers, of course. And we will learn strategies for normalizing and effectively coping with anticipatory grief. And finally, we will think about and share ways we are supporting ourselves and or caregivers and family members who are experiencing anticipatory grief. So those are our general learning objectives for today. Before we get started, like any good social worker, like any good mental health professional, I want to remind everyone to take good care of yourself as you listen to this presentation. Everyone has their own grief and loss experiences, and caregiver history and family history. And some of us have been through more challenging and more numerous experiences with grief and loss than others. Please remember to put your own oxygen mask on first before helping others, meaning you might need to take care of yourself emotionally before you can help someone else cope with a loss. Only share as you feel comfortable doing so at the end when we have time for discussion. No one will be asked to share anticipatory grief or grief experiences, but I welcome you to share openly after the presentation if it would be meaningful for you to do so. I also support all participants to take a break as you need to. If you need to step out or pause, if you're listening later, the presentation, to take a break, to take care of yourself, that makes total sense, and I really encourage you to do so. The most important thing is for you to take good care of yourself as we go through this challenging information together. All right, so it's important for us to start out with a clear definition of anticipatory grief. And I recognize that this might be a new term for many people, even people who have been involved in dementia caregiving and being aware of this disease process for a long time. It doesn't mean that you have necessarily heard this term. Anticipatory grief refers to the complicated emotional process that can take place in people who are experiencing the death of a loved one. This type of grief can be just as powerful as grief experienced after the death of a loved one, and can be a tremendous weight for a caregiver or family member to carry. And we'll talk more about what that looks like for caregivers and family members. People who are caregivers for or family members of people with Alzheimer's or other dementias tend to experience a unique version of anticipatory grief, something many doctors refer to as dementia grief. Anticipatory grief for those caring for people living with dementia is distinguished by the memory loss and the personality changes that a person with dementia exhibits, which can leave caregivers and family members feeling like their loved one has already died or is already gone. Despite the fact that they are still physically present, psychologically, the loved one with dementia is no longer the same person they were before, which is something referred to as ambiguous loss. So that's another term that I want to bring to you today, where even though the person is still with us, they feel lost to us, and that feeling is ambiguous by nature. Pauline Boss in 1999, researcher Pauline Boss identified ambiguous loss for dementia caregivers and family members as the person being physically present, but psychologically absent, as I mentioned before. So there are plenty of references at the end of this presentation if you'd like to read more about the terms that you're hearing today. So what happens when someone is experiencing anticipatory grief? Well, it really means that they are going through and experiencing various emotional reactions that we would typically see after someone has died. Anticipatory grief involves experiencing various aspects of grief while the person is living, and often while caring for the person or assisting with their care. When going through anticipatory grief, caregivers and families can experience some of the well-known stages of grief described by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her seminal work on death and dying, including the stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And these are likely familiar to many of you who have researched or read about the grief and loss experience. Kubler-Ross noted that everyone experiences at least 2 of the 5 stages of grief. And she acknowledged that some people may revisit stages over many years throughout life. We know that grief is also not a linear process, even though I think Kubler-Ross originally presented this model as a linear process. We know that ultimately grief is not a linear process. We don't always begin with denial and end at some point with acceptance. And we often experience various stages such as anger, depression, and acceptance throughout our lives as we recall or take ourselves back to that knowledge or experience of the grief. What we also know is that there are other emotional responses associated with grief, such as the ones you see here, such as bitterness, sadness, guilt, despair, and also joy and love as well. One of the most important things for caregivers, family members, and those supporting them to remember is that these experiences of anticipatory grief are normal and should be expected as the loved one with dementia experiences a decline in their health and in their abilities. Often caregivers and families might feel judged, or they might be judged for these feelings or for experiences of grief when their loved one is still alive. For example, a family member who expresses that they feel their loved one is already gone might be accused of giving up on their family member or wishing that their family member was gone. Later in the presentation, I'll share some strategies for effectively coping with anticipatory grief, including normalizing it, which is really important, normalizing it within the experiences of caregivers and family members. All right, so let's take a look at some of the losses related to anticipatory grief. The reason that anticipatory grief can be so acute or pronounced for many caregivers and families is because there are many losses experienced over the course of the dementia disease process. Caregivers and family members can lose shared memories and experiences. They can lose intimacy, such as between partners or spouses. They can lose companionship, family roles, tasks, such as the person being the matriarch of the family or patriarch of the family, and so many other losses that you see here. Some losses are often not recognized by others, such as the loss of privacy or comfort in the home if attendant care in the home is needed, or loud, bulky pieces of medical equipment are required. As a hospice social worker, I remember visiting folks in their homes, and they might have, a loud oxygen machine going, and they had attendant care coming and going. And I often reflected on the fact that they had lost privacy in their home to a certain extent. They had lost the ability to just have a quiet home as well. And so these are losses that are often not recognized by others. Another unrecognized loss is the ability to plan for the future, or even potentially the loss of one's faith if they begin to question their spiritual beliefs in the face of all of these losses you see here. And these are just some, these are not all. All of these losses can intensify and exacerbate the experience of anticipatory grief for caregivers and their families. And they're really important to keep in mind as we think about ways to support ourselves if we're caregivers or family members, or if we're supporting those caregivers and family members. So I just mentioned how many of these losses go unrecognized by friends, coworkers, or society at large. Researchers have coined a term for this specific type of grief. In addition to anticipatory grief, caregivers and family members can experience what's called disenfranchised grief, which is characterized by unacknowledged, minimized, or stigmatized bereavement that may cause extreme isolation for the griever. This term can also be used when the nature of the death itself can cause disenfranchisement in the case of cases of homicide, suicide, or other stigmatizing deaths where simply people just don't want to talk about it, don't want to recognize it. Some dementia caregivers and family members can feel disenfranchised in their grief because they are not seen as legitimate grievers. Their loved one, after all, is still alive and still with us. And many people do not understand these legitimate feelings of grief when someone hasn't actually died. It's also important to note that cultural and spiritual values inform whether someone believes it's acceptable or appropriate to grieve for someone before they have died. So it simply might not be in line with someone's spiritual beliefs or cultural beliefs to grieve before someone has died. The paradox of disenfranchised grief is that the griever is often isolated in their experience because others don't see the grief as valid, despite the fact that the griever has increased needs for support during this time. So it truly is a paradox, but it's one that we can address and recognize and provide support around. All right, so what grief and loss researchers have also found is that we all have common symptoms of grief that manifest cognitively, emotionally, and physically. When family members and caregivers are experiencing anticipatory grief, they may be exhibiting these symptoms and struggling to care for themselves and for the person living with dementia. Some of these symptoms are probably familiar to those of you who have experienced multiple losses in your life. For example, cognitively, we might be forgetful or have difficulty making decisions. Our judgment can also be impaired, which can be especially difficult when caregivers and loved ones are being asked to make difficult care-related decisions as their loved one's condition changes over time. When I worked in hospice care, many of my fabulous nurse colleagues would sometimes ask me if I could help the family make a healthcare decision a bit faster. They needed that healthcare decision to be made so that they could execute the plan of care. But I always reminded them that dementia caregivers and families are actively grieving and might need even more time to make those decisions, that it might be really hard for them to make a decision quickly. And that grief is really a main factor that can make the decision making more difficult or more complicated. The emotional symptoms are also likely familiar to you. I want to especially highlight that it's perfectly normal and common for people to experience anger towards the person living with dementia. And I know that may sound strange or challenging, but it's important for us to acknowledge that anger is a symptom of grief and something we really want to be aware of. This anger can manifest for a variety of reasons. Sometimes the caregiver or family member is upset because they feel left behind by their loved one, even though the person is still living. Caregivers and family members can also experience feelings of guilt, even though there was nothing they could have done to prevent the disease process for their loved one. Sometimes the grieving person doesn't feel anything at all and experiences numbness around the many losses. This can be a coping strategy adopted by the brain to help us avoid experiencing pain. Or we might experience numbness after our adrenaline or fight or flight response has run its course during the earlier stages of the disease process. Finally, we can experience physical symptoms associated with grief, including the ones you see listed here. We can experience difficulty sleeping or too much sleeping, oversleeping. We might have a total loss of appetite or an ongoing fatigue. While these symptoms are normative and expected as part of the grief process, they are symptoms that need to be monitored and addressed if they persist without improvement over several weeks or several months. Due to the wide array of anticipatory grief symptoms we can experience, taking good care of ourselves becomes even more important. We might need more breaks in our day for rest or reflection. We can be overwhelmed with emotion at times, and it's very important to take time to express those emotions, to process those emotions, rather than kind of stuffing them away or saying, oh, I'll take care of that later. At the end of the presentation, I will share some ways to support yourself and others in coping with these symptoms and cultivating joy and resilience in the face of anticipatory grief. We know that the impact of these anticipatory grief symptoms and stressors on caregivers and loved ones are significant. Research shows that very clearly. A 2009 study found that anticipatory grief was shown to be significantly and independently associated with caregiver burden beyond the effects of known predictors such as background characteristics, behavior problems in the care recipient, and depressive symptoms. So even factoring in all of those other variables, anticipatory grief was still found to be highly correlated with caregiver burden. A more recent study in 2020 showed that the anticipatory grief experience is characterized by traumatic distress from being exposed to life-threatening conditions and the separation distress induced by loss anticipation and current relational losses, all of those losses that I talked about earlier. These two studies are just a couple of examples of a growing body of literature showing the impact of anticipatory grief on caregivers and family members. This research demonstrates why it's so important that anticipatory grief is recognized and addressed within the dementia caregiver and family member experience. I want to also point out that research is showing that the impact of anticipatory grief seems to intensify over time and may be more pronounced for spousal or partnered caregivers. One recent study found that spousal caregivers caring for relatives in later stages of dementia experience the highest level of anticipatory grief and caregiving burden as compared with spousal caregivers for relatives in earlier stages of dementia, and as compared to adult children caregivers, which I thought was especially notable. Spousal caregivers of relatives in later stages of dementia were also found to have significantly higher levels of anticipatory grief. So research is telling us that anticipatory grief might be even more acute and more challenging for spouses and partners, especially in those later stages of the disease process. So how can we cope and heal and foster resilience in the face of anticipatory grief? How can caregivers and family members navigate this process and take good care of themselves? Here are some strategies commonly found in the mental health and physical health literature. First, it can be very helpful and validating for the caregiver or family member to access information on anticipatory grief. Reading and researching about this type of grief can go a long way in normalizing the experience and validating the feelings and reactions someone is having as they go through anticipatory grief. As I mentioned before, caregivers and family members could be carrying a lot of guilt or anger, and normalizing these emotions can be very validating and possibly therapeutic for caregivers and family members. Utilizing attendant, volunteer, hospice, and/or palliative care support for coping and decreasing the care burden can also be an empowering step for many caregivers and family members. Grieving actually takes time. When I teach students in class, we talk about this, that grieving takes time. It's not something that you can do in a short period of time. And we really do ourselves a service by facilitating that time for the grieving. If someone has no minutes to spare for themselves, then they won't be able to acknowledge and process the anticipatory grief and the many losses, right? The many losses they're experiencing. If there's no time for the caregiver or family member to grieve, then the symptoms that I described earlier can worsen. And that's when we start to see caregivers and loved ones developing mental health and or health problems that can impair their entire life functioning. We also don't want caregivers and family members to go it alone. And we want to encourage everyone to remember to connect with their social support network, right? I always used to ask hospice family members that I served, who can you call to talk about what you're feeling and what you're going through? Because I knew that this social support was such an important part of their coping with the anticipatory grief and just with the stressors that they were experiencing. Again, it's so important for caregivers and family members to also access respite or breaks when possible, to cultivate joyful experiences, such as seeing a movie with a friend or just walking in the park. When caregivers and family members are with their loved ones with dementia, another helpful strategy is to cultivate joyful experiences. For example, they can listen to music that both they and their loved one enjoy, or they can spend time in nature to create joy or to facilitate joy without relying on the shared memories or experiences that the dementia process has lessened or taken away. Some caregivers might also benefit from journaling or mindful meditation to express and make meaning of the anticipatory grief they are experiencing. But again, that takes time. And so caregivers or family members might need to even schedule time for journaling or mindful meditation. Some people might also benefit from nurturing their spirituality or spending time with their faith community as they grieve during their loved one's disease process. And this can be really important for folks who have a strong sense of faith, that they go ahead and get that support around their anticipatory grief while their loved one is still living. Of course, attending a support group with other dementia caregivers and family members has been shown to be an incredibly validating and therapeutic intervention. And I have some resources for these types of support groups on the next slide. They may be familiar to you, but I wanted to list them anyway, just in case folks could benefit from those. And finally, it's so important to practice self-compassion when going through anticipatory grief. Self-compassion, and I just recently learned more about this term, is the ability to turn understanding, acceptance, and love inward for yourself, and to know that you're doing the best you can with the resources you have in the moment. And I think this is so true for dementia caregivers and family members, which is why I wanted to share this concept with you today. So I really encourage that self-compassion for all of those supporting people living with dementia. And here are just a few of the anticipatory grief resources that I thought would be helpful for those attending today. These agencies have a list of local support groups that anyone could attend, caregivers, family members, to get support around grief and anticipatory grief. And so if you click on these links, that you can find a long list of local support groups where caregivers and family members could access this type of support. All right, well, I'd love to open it up to questions, reflections, shared experiences at this time. And thank you so much.